In the summer of 2019, an excavation team working in the ancient necropolis of Saqqara made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about Egyptian burial practices. When they opened a sealed tomb that had remained untouched for over 3,000 years, they expected to find the usual array of treasures and carefully preserved mummies. What they found instead was carnage. A human body, already mummified with all the care and expense that process required, had been deliberately destroyed. The skull was shattered, the limbs were severed cleanly at the joints, and carved into the limestone wall beside this broken body, a message in ancient hieroglyphs that roughly translates to something far more disturbing than any curse. The soul must not depart. This was not the work of tomb raiders. This was not damage from 3,000 years of decay. This was done deliberately, methodically, by the very priests who were supposed to protect the dead. And what makes your skin crawl is this. The mutilation happened after the body was already mummified. Someone went back, months after the burial, opened the sealed tomb, and destroyed this person a second time. The excavation team was expecting another routine burial chamber, maybe some pottery, perhaps a few amulets. What they found instead was something the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities seemed almost reluctant to discuss in detail. 37 bodies, all showing signs of deliberate post-mortem mutilation. Skulls crushed with precision, hands and feet removed and placed in specific positions. And on 16 of them, those same hieroglyphs, the soul must not depart, the soul must remain, the soul must be contained. Dr. Salima Hassan, the lead archaeologist, gave exactly one interview before going silent. In that interview, she said something that never made it into the mainstream press. She said the mutilations followed a pattern, a ritual pattern, the same cuts in the same places, across different time periods spanning over 500 years. This was not random violence. This was a procedure, a protocol, and judging by how widespread it was sanctioned at the highest levels of Egyptian religious authority. Now, here is where it gets truly unsettling. The people who were mutilated were not criminals. They were not slaves or prisoners of war. Analysis of the burial goods and tomb inscriptions revealed something shocking. These were priests, high-ranking officials, members of the royal court, people who would have known the deepest secrets of Egyptian magic and the afterlife. People who, in theory, would have had the strongest souls, the most powerful ka. So, why would the ancient Egyptians go to such extreme lengths to trap these specific souls? What were they afraid these people would do in the afterlife? And, more disturbingly, what did the ancient priests know about the nature of consciousness and the soul that we have somehow forgotten? This is not some wild theory from internet forums. Major museums have these mutilated mummies in their collections right now. The British Museum has several. The Cairo Museum has dozens more locked in storage, not on public display. When you ask curators about them, you get carefully worded responses about ritual punishment or post-mortem desecration by enemies. But those explanations fall apart when you look at the evidence. The timing does not match. The precision does not match. And most importantly, the sheer scale does not match. We are talking about thousands of bodies across multiple sites spanning over a millennium of Egyptian history. This was not a few isolated incidents. This was institutional, systematic, and it was done by the very people who wrote the Book of the Dead, who perfected mummification, who built the pyramids. The same civilization that obsessed over preserving the body and ensuring safe passage to the afterlife was simultaneously destroying certain people's chances of ever reaching it. Hey, this is Mr. H, and if you are already feeling that tingle of curiosity mixed with unease, you are in the right place. We are about to go deep into one of history's most disturbing secrets, something that has been hiding in plain sight in museums and academic papers for over a century. If you want to keep exploring these kinds of mysteries with me, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this rabbit hole goes much deeper than you might imagine. Trust me, you will want to come back for what we uncover next. So let us start with the fundamental question that should terrify anyone who thinks about it seriously. The ancient Egyptians did not fear death. Their entire civilization was built around embracing it, preparing for it, ensuring eternal life beyond it. But they did fear something. They feared the dead becoming too powerful. They feared certain souls escaping containment. They feared what would happen if someone who knew the secret names of the gods, who understood the words of power, who possessed knowledge of the hidden realms, if that person's soul was allowed to roam free in the afterlife. And that fear was so profound, so deeply embedded in their religious worldview, that they developed a counter-ritual, a dark mirror image of everything mummification was supposed to accomplish. While one set of priests carefully preserved bodies and performed the opening of the mouth ceremony to give the dead their faculties back, another set of priests had a different job entirely. Their job was to make absolutely certain that some people stayed dead, not just dead, trapped, contained, powerless, for all eternity. Welcome to the story of why the ancient Egyptians mutilated their own dead, and the terrifying secret they believed about the human soul. When most people think about ancient Egyptian beliefs in the afterlife, they picture golden sarcophagi, pyramids reaching toward the heavens, and the romantic notion of eternal life among the gods. We have been fed a sanitized version of Egyptian spirituality, one that focuses on the beauty, the artistry, the triumph over death. But that is only half the story. The other half, the part that makes Egyptologists uncomfortable at dinner parties, is far darker. The ancient Egyptians did not just believe in an afterlife. They believed in a complicated, dangerous, and frankly terrifying journey through the underworld called the Duat. And not everyone made it through. In fact, most people probably did not. The Book of the Dead, that famous collection of spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife, is not a guarantee of salvation. It is more like a survival manual for a realm filled with demons, lakes of fire, and gods who might devour you on a whim. But here is what they do not tell you in museum exhibits. There was another outcome, one worse than simply failing the judgment of Osiris. The Egyptians called it the second death, and unlike the first death, which was merely physical, the second death meant total annihilation. Your soul, your essence, your very existence wiped from reality, not just killed, but unmade, erased from the cosmic record as if you had never existed at all. The Book of the Dead contains a spell 125b, that specifically addresses this horror. Most translations gloss over it or frame it as a warning against sinful behavior. But when you read the original hieratic script, the terror becomes visceral. It describes a process of systematic destruction. The heart being devoured by Amit, yes, but then something more. The car being scattered, the bar being bound, the name being struck from all records. This was not just punishment, this was metaphysical execution. Now, the Egyptians believed you had multiple souls, not just one immortal essence, but several components that made up your complete being. There was the ka, your life force, the spiritual double created at birth. There was the ba, your personality, often depicted as a human-headed bird that could travel between worlds. And there was the ach, the transformed, enlightened spirit that achieved immortality. These three are well documented. Every Egyptology textbook covers them. But there was a fourth component that rarely gets mentioned, the shot, the shadow soul. And this is where things get genuinely strange. The shot was not just your literal shadow, it was believed to be a dark aspect of your being, a part of you that existed in the spaces between light and darkness, life and death. Ancient texts describe it as having will, agency, even the ability to act independently from the person who cast it. And, unlike the other aspects of the soul, the shoot was dangerous, potentially malevolent, something that needed to be controlled. Very few papyri discuss the shoot in any detail. The mentions that do exist are brief, cryptic, almost deliberately vague. It is as if the scribes were afraid to write too much about it. One fragment from the Middle Kingdom describes a ritual called the binding of the shadow, performed on certain individuals before burial. The ritual involved driving bronze nails through the four corners of the burial chamber, while reciting incantations meant to pin the shadow in place, to prevent it from wandering, from causing harm, from seeking revenge. Think about that for a moment. An entire aspect of Egyptian spirituality that has been largely scrubbed from the historical record. Why? What were they so afraid of that they could not even write it down properly? And more importantly, who were these certain individuals whose shadows needed to be bound? This brings us to the concept of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. We typically associate this with Roman culture, where disgraced emperors had their names chiseled off monuments and their statues destroyed. But the Egyptians practiced it centuries earlier, and they took it much further. For them, erasing someone from memory was not just political revenge, it was spiritual warfare. Your name was not just a label, it was a vital component of your existence. Without your name being spoken, without it being written and remembered, you ceased to exist in the afterlife. You became nothing. Pharaoh Akhenaten is the most famous victim of this practice. He tried to revolutionize Egyptian religion, abandoning the traditional pantheon in favor of worshipping a single god, the Aten. After his death, the priesthood that he had marginalized came back with a vengeance. They systematically destroyed his monuments, scratched his name from every surface, defaced his images. His capital city was abandoned and left to crumble. For all intents and purposes, they tried to erase him from history. But it went deeper than that. Akhenaten's mummy has never been definitively found. There are candidates, including the controversial remains from Tomb KV55, but nothing conclusive. Some researchers believe his body was not just lost, it was deliberately destroyed, not out of spite, but as part of a ritual, a way to ensure his soul, his ka, his ba, could never reconstitute themselves, that he would suffer not just damnatio memoriae, but total spiritual annihilation, and he was not alone. Queen Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs, suffered similar treatment after her death. Her successor, Thutmose III, spent decades methodically erasing her from the official record. Her statues were smashed, her cartouches chiseled away, her temples reassigned to other rulers. Was this just political housekeeping, cleaning up the inconvenience of a woman who dared to rule as a man? Or was there a deeper, more sinister purpose, a spiritual assassination to accompany the historical one? The pattern repeats throughout Egyptian history. Certain individuals, particularly those who challenged the religious establishment or who possessed esoteric knowledge, faced not just physical death, but a campaign to destroy their very souls. And the priests had tools for this. Techniques passed down through generations, written in texts that were never meant for public consumption. One of these texts, a fragmentary papyrus currently housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo but rarely displayed, describes what it calls the ritual of unbinding. Most scholars who have studied it assume it refers to freeing a soul from the body during mummification. But a minority interpretation, one that has been quietly circulating among researchers for decades, suggests it means something else entirely, unbinding in the sense of dissolving, dispersing, taking a soul apart piece by piece until nothing remains that could be called a coherent consciousness. The ritual involves specific mutilations performed in a precise order. First, the removal of the tongue, because the tongue speaks the words of power. Without it, the deceased cannot recite the spells needed to navigate the duat. Then the hands, because hands make offerings to the gods and perform ritual gestures. Without hands, the soul cannot propitiate the divine judges it will encounter. Then the feet, because feet allow movement through the underworld. And finally, in some cases, the heart, not during mummification, when it was traditionally left in place, but afterward, coming back to remove it from an already prepared mummy. The heart was the seat of consciousness, the organ weighed against the feather of Maat in the judgment hall of Osiris. Without a heart, there could be no judgment, no passage, no afterlife at all. This was not theoretical. This was not mythology. This was practical theology. The Egyptians believed, with absolute conviction, that these procedures worked, that you could trap a soul, bind it, prevent it from moving on, and they had centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to do it. Consider the opening of the mouth ceremony, one of the most important rituals in the mummification process. It involved touching the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy with special tools, symbolically restoring the deceased's ability to eat, see, hear, and breathe in the afterlife. It was meant to reanimate the body's spiritual functions, but like any technology, it could be reversed. There are references in some texts to a closing of the mouth, a counter-ritual that sealed those same functions, that locked the soul inside the body with no way to interact with the world of the dead. Imagine being conscious, aware, but completely unable to move, speak, or act, trapped in your own corpse for eternity. That is the fate these rituals were designed to inflict. Not oblivion, which might be merciful, but an endless, silent imprisonment. And who performed these rituals? Not just any priest. There was a specific class of clergy called Sem priests. In the standard narrative, Sem priests were simply the ones who performed mummification and funerary rites. They wore distinctive leopard skin cloaks and were considered pure enough to approach the dead, but their role was more complex than that. Sem priests were gatekeepers. They controlled who got a proper burial and who did not. They decided which souls deserved passage to the afterlife and which ones needed to be contained. The position was hereditary and secretive. Sem priests trained for years, learning not just the publicly known rituals but the hidden ones, the dangerous ones, They were the only people authorized to handle what the Egyptians called Heka, usually translated as magic, but more accurately understood as the fundamental force that shaped reality. Heka was not good or evil, it simply was. And in the wrong hands, or directed toward the wrong purposes, it could unmake creation itself. There are tomb paintings showing Sem priests performing the opening of the mouth ceremony. They are always depicted with calm, serene faces, carrying out a sacred duty. But there are other images, much rarer, found in tombs that are not open to the public. Images showing priests in those same leopard skins standing over bodies in very different poses. Bodies with missing limbs. Bodies surrounded by protective symbols meant to contain rather than liberate. Bodies with hieroglyphs carved directly into the wrappings, spells not of protection but of binding. These images are not in your coffee table book about ancient Egypt. They are catalogued in obscure academic journals, photographed once during excavations in the early 20th century, and then quietly stored away, because they complicate the narrative. They suggest that Egyptian religion had a shadow side, practices that were not about honoring the dead but about controlling them, imprisoning them, making sure they could never rise again. So why? Why would a civilization so obsessed with the afterlife develop such elaborate methods to deny it to certain people? The standard explanation is punishment. These were traitors, heretics, criminals who deserved to have their souls destroyed. And that certainly accounts for some cases, but not all of them. Not the priests who were mutilated, not the officials who were buried with wealth and honors before having their tombs violated years later, not the individuals whose identities were deliberately obscured, whose names were erased before the mutilation even occurred. There is another possibility, one that researchers are only beginning to seriously consider. What if the Egyptians were not punishing these people? What if they were containing them? What if certain individuals were believed to have souls so powerful, so knowledgeable, so potentially dangerous, that allowing them to roam free in the afterlife posed an existential threat? Think about it from the Egyptian perspective. Magic was real, the gods were real, the afterlife was real, and if someone who understood the deepest mysteries of reality, who knew the true names of the gods, who possessed secrets that could reshape the cosmos, if that person died with their faculties intact, what could they do in the world of the dead? Could they challenge the gods? Could they return to the world of the living as something worse than a ghost? Could they break the fundamental laws that kept order in the universe? The Egyptians had a word for the primordial chaos that existed before creation. They called it Isfet. It was not evil, exactly, but it was disorder, entropy, the unmaking of everything. And the pharaohs, the priests, the entire religious apparatus existed to hold Isfet at bay, to maintain Ma'at, cosmic order and balance. But what if certain souls, powerful souls, angry souls, souls that had been wronged or simply souls that knew too much, what if they represented a crack in that order? A potential gateway for Isfet to seep back into reality? That fear, that cosmic paranoia, would explain a lot. It would explain why the mutilations were so specific, so ritualized. It would explain why they targeted people of knowledge and power rather than common criminals. It would explain why the practice continued for over 1,000 years despite the enormous effort and resources required. And it would explain why, even today, there seems to be a reluctance to fully acknowledge what was done and why. Because if the Egyptians were right, if souls are real and can be trapped, if consciousness persists after death and can be manipulated, then every museum with a mutilated mummy might be housing something far more disturbing than a historical curiosity. They might be storing prisons, containers designed to hold something that was never meant to be released. And some of those containers are starting to fail. Before we go any further into this, I am genuinely curious about something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Are you watching this in broad daylight? Maybe during your lunch break? Or are you like so many of my viewers who wait until night falls to dive into mysteries like these? There is something about exploring ancient darkness that just hits different when the sun goes down, right? Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing how this community spans the entire globe, all of us drawn to the same questions about what our ancestors knew and what they feared. Now, let us talk about the actual evidence, the physical bodies that prove this was not just mythology or religious poetry, but something that actually happened to real people. Let us talk about evidence. Hard, physical, undeniable evidence that sits in climate-controlled storage rooms and museum basements around the world. Because whatever theoretical discussions we might have about Egyptian beliefs, whatever philosophical debates about the nature of the soul, None of it matters if we cannot point to actual bodies and say, this happened, this is real, and it is real, disturbingly, unambiguously real. The Abydos discovery is where we need to start. Abydos, for those unfamiliar, is one of the oldest and most sacred sites in Egypt. It was believed to be the burial place of Osiris himself, the god of the afterlife. Pilgrims traveled there for thousands of years, hoping to be buried near the god, believing it would guarantee their passage to paradise. In the early 2000s, a joint excavation team from the University of Pennsylvania and Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities was working on a cemetery dating to the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 to 1700 BC. They expected nothing unusual. Old Kingdom nobility, some pottery, the usual funerary equipment. What they found was a mass grave. 41 individuals, all carefully mummified, all buried with appropriate goods and amulets, and every single one of them had been systematically dismembered after mummification, not before, after. The distinction matters enormously. When you cut into a freshly dead body, you get clean edges, blood staining, tissue damage that looks a certain way under microscopic analysis. When you cut into a mummified body, you get something completely different. The tissues are already desiccated, the organs removed, the entire structure preserved with natron and resins. Cutting through mummified flesh requires different tools, leaves different marks, and that is exactly what the forensic analysis showed. Dr. Joseph Wegner, who led the excavation, published a preliminary report in 2014 that created barely a ripple in mainstream archaeology. But if you read between the lines, if you pay attention to what he is carefully not saying, the implications are staggering. He notes that the dismemberments follow consistent patterns across all 41 bodies. Left hand removed at the wrist, right foot at the ankle. In some cases, both legs severed at the knee. And in 12 cases, post-mortem cranial fractures that could only have been caused by deliberate, forceful blows to the skull. The report uses clinical language, peri-mortem trauma, post-depositional interference. But when you strip away the academic terminology, what you have is this. Someone came back to these graves, possibly months or years after burial, opened them up, and systematically crippled the mummies inside, and then resealed everything as if nothing had happened. The graves showed no signs of looting. The jewelry was still in place. The canopic jars were undisturbed. Whatever happened, it was not robbery. It was something else, something purposeful and ritualistic, and judging by the effort involved, something that the authorities considered absolutely necessary. Now, Egypt has a long history of archaeological discoveries being mishandled, misinterpreted, or conveniently misplaced when they do not fit the preferred narrative. But technology is making it harder to sweep things under the rug. CT scanning has revolutionized our understanding of mummies without having to unwrap them. And what those scans are revealing is that mutilation was far more common than anyone wanted to admit. In 2012, researchers at Cairo University conducted a comprehensive CT scan survey of mummies in the Egyptian Museum's storage facilities. They scanned over 300 specimens, most of which had never been properly examined beyond the initial cataloguing when they were acquired, some as far back as the 19th century. The results were quietly published in a specialized radiology journal that most Egyptologists probably never read, but the data is there. Public record, available to anyone who bothers to look. 23% of the mummies showed signs of post-mortem mutilation that occurred after the mummification process was complete. 23%. That is not a handful of outliers. That is not statistical noise. That is nearly 1 in 4. The researchers broke it down into categories based on the type and location of damage. Type 1. Removal of extremities. Hands, feet, fingers, toes. This was the most common, accounting for 60% of the mutilation cases. The cuts were clean, made with sharp bronze or copper implements. In many cases, the removed body parts were found placed elsewhere in the wrapping, positioned deliberately. Hands crossed over the pelvis, feet placed beside the head, as if the positioning itself had significance. Type 2. Cranial destruction. 40% of mutilation cases showed intentional damage to the skull, not from tomb collapse or rough handling during excavation. Fracture patterns consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object. In some instances, the skull was completely shattered and the fragments scattered through the wrappings. One specimen, catalogue number JE 97341, had its skull removed entirely and replaced with a bundle of linen strips soaked in resin. The actual skull was found at the foot of the sarcophagus, every bone separately broken into pieces no larger than a coin. Type 3. Cardiac extraction. This is the rarest and most significant, only 8% of the mutilation cases, but by far the most disturbing. The heart, which was always supposed to be left in the body during mummification because it was needed for the judgment in the afterlife, was removed post-mummification. The chest cavity was cut open through the existing incision used for embalming, the heart extracted, and the cavity filled with sand or broken pottery shards. Some of these mummies had hieratic inscriptions inked directly onto the ribs beneath where the heart had been. Most are too fragmentary to translate fully, but one clear phrase keeps appearing: "No judgment shall proceed." Type 4. Lingual mutilation. The removal of the tongue. This was documented in 12 cases, all of them from the New Kingdom period. The tongue was either pulled out through the mouth or, in more extreme cases, cut out by slicing through the base of the jaw from underneath. Remember, the tongue was essential for reciting the spells and declarations needed to navigate the afterlife. Without it, you were effectively mute in the underworld, unable to speak your name to the gods, unable to recite the negative confessions, unable to plead your case before Osiris. These are not ancient interpretations or religious theories. These are measurable, documentable physical facts, bodies that have been violated in specific, consistent ways across different time periods and locations. And the question that keeps coming back is, why? What was the purpose? What were they trying to achieve? The conventional explanation from mainstream Egyptology is that these represent punishment for crimes, tomb desecration of criminals, enemies of the state, people who betrayed the pharaoh. And certainly, there are historical records of executions and subsequent denial of proper burial. But that explanation falls apart when you examine who these people actually were. The Abydos bodies? Based on the burial goods and the location, these were middle to upper-class individuals, probably local officials or priests, not criminals or prisoners. The Cairo Museum specimens with the most extensive mutilation, many of them were buried in tombs that required significant wealth and authorization to construct. Some have titles inscribed on their coffins: overseer of the granaries, lector, priest, scribe of the House of Life. These were not enemies of the state. These were the state. One mummy in particular stands out. British Museum specimen EA 26,953. Acquired during excavations at Thebes in 1892, it has been on and off display for over a century. The placard describes it as a priest from the 21st dynasty, roughly 1000 BC. What the placard does not mention is that when the mummy was CT scanned in 2008, they discovered something extraordinary. The mummification itself was absolutely first-rate. Top-tier work, expensive materials, expert technique, all the internal organs properly preserved in canopic jars. This was someone important who could afford the best embalmers available. But at some point after the burial, someone came back and performed a procedure. They made an incision at the base of the skull, inserted a tool, and destroyed the brain tissue that had been left in place. Then they filled the cranial cavity with molten resin and small fragments of obsidian, and they sealed the skull back up so carefully that the violation was invisible to the naked eye. It was only the density differences on the CT scan that revealed what had been done. Obsidian. That detail is crucial. Obsidian was not a common material in Egypt. It had to be imported, probably from Ethiopia or the Red Sea region. It was expensive and associated with specific ritual purposes. In some texts, obsidian is described as the stone of the underworld, the material from which the knives of the gods were made. Placing obsidian fragments inside someone's skull was not random. It was deliberate, symbolic, almost certainly magical. Dr. Paul Nicholson at Cardiff University has studied this mummy extensively. In a lecture he gave in 2015, which you can still find buried in academic archives online, he made a statement that got him some sharp criticism from colleagues. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, that the procedure performed on this mummy resembles nothing so much as a lobotomy, an attempt to destroy the consciousness, the personality, the thing that makes a person who they are, not just to kill the body, which was already dead, but to kill the mind, to make sure that whatever survived death, whatever continued on, was broken, incapable of thought or action. He was careful to add that this was speculation, that we cannot know for certain what the ancient priests believed they were accomplishing, but the physical evidence is clear. Someone went to enormous trouble and expense to destroy this person's brain after they were already dead and mummified. That is not punishment. That is neutralization. That is making sure something stays down. Now, these are just the cases we know about. The mummies that made it into museum collections, that have been scanned and studied. How many more are still in the ground? How many were found by early archaeologists who did not recognize what they were looking at, or who chose not to report it because it did not fit the romantic narrative of ancient Egypt they were trying to sell to their benefactors? And how many were found and deliberately reburied because what they represented was too disturbing to acknowledge? There are rumors, always rumors in Egyptology, whispered conversations at conferences, stories passed between excavation teams, of tombs found in the Valley of the Kings that were mapped but never officially opened, of mummies discovered during construction projects in Cairo and Luxor that disappeared into government storage and never appeared in any catalogue, of private collections held by wealthy families who bought up artifacts in the 19th century and now will not allow researchers access because of what those artifacts might reveal. One story that keeps circulating involves an excavation in the early 1930s near Saqqara. A French team supposedly found a burial chamber containing the remains of 9 individuals, all priests based on the hieroglyphics, all showing extreme mutilation. But the chamber also contained something else: papyrus scrolls describing the procedure in detail, instructions for how to trap a soul, what spells to recite, what cuts to make, when to perform each step of the ritual. According to the story, the Egyptian authorities confiscated everything immediately. The lead archaeologist was expelled from the country, and all records of the discovery were sealed under national security provisions. Is it true? Impossible to verify. The French Archaeological Institute in Cairo has no record of such an excavation, but then again, they also have gaps in their archives from that period. Missing files, incomplete reports, things that should be there but are not. What is verifiable is that certain excavations from the colonial era, particularly those that took place before the establishment of strict antiquities laws, resulted in artifacts being scattered across the world, private sales, gifts to wealthy patrons, items traded between institutions without proper documentation, and some of those artifacts are only now being properly studied as museums digitize their collections and create comprehensive databases. A curator at a mid-sized European museum, who asked not to be named, contacted me last year after watching one of my previous videos. She said they had recently catalogued a mummy that had been in storage since the museum acquired it in 1887. No one had examined it in detail until they did a condition assessment for insurance purposes. When they unwrapped a small section for analysis, they found that the mummy's jaw had been removed and replaced with a carved piece of wood, not as a restoration. The wood was ancient, coated in the same resin as the rest of the wrappings. It had been done as part of the original burial preparation, and carved into that wooden jaw, in tiny hieratic script, was a phrase that roughly translates to "silence eternal." She asked if I knew of any similar cases. If this was a known burial practice, I told her what I knew, which is that it absolutely was not standard practice, that it represented something else, something that most Egyptologists either do not recognize or choose not to discuss. She thanked me and said they were going to do a full CT scan and document everything properly. That was 8 months ago. I have not heard from her since, and the museum's online database still lists that mummy with the same vague 19th century description. No mention of the jaw, no updated analysis, nothing. Maybe they are still working on it. Maybe the research is proceeding slowly, as these things do. Or maybe someone told them to stop asking questions, to leave certain things undocumented, to let some mysteries remain mysteries. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that no one wants to say out loud. The physical evidence of widespread, systematic, ritualized mutilation of Egyptian mummies is overwhelming. It is sitting in storage rooms and display cases around the world. Any researcher with access and the right equipment could verify it. The bodies do not lie. The CT scans do not lie. The forensic analysis does not lie. What happened, happened. But why it happened, and what the ancient Egyptians thought they were accomplishing, that is where things get dangerous. That is where you start asking questions that challenge not just our understanding of ancient Egypt, but our understanding of consciousness, death, and the possibility that our ancestors knew something about the nature of reality that we have forgotten or chosen to ignore. And maybe, just maybe, there are people who would prefer we continue ignoring it. Before we go deeper into this, I am genuinely curious about something. How many of you have actually stood in front of an Egyptian mummy in a museum? Have you ever looked at one and wondered about the person inside, what their life was like, how they died. Drop a comment and let me know where you saw it. Was it the British Museum, the Met, maybe the Cairo Museum itself? And here is the real question. Did the museum tell you everything about that mummy, or do you think there might be details they left out of that little placard on the wall? Because after what we have covered so far, you have to wonder what else is not being said. Understanding what was done to these bodies is one thing. Understanding how it was done, the actual mechanics and rituals involved, that takes us into territory that makes even seasoned researchers uncomfortable. Because we are not talking about crude violence or random desecration. We are talking about procedures, carefully orchestrated religious ceremonies performed by trained specialists who believed, absolutely and without question, that what they were doing had power. Real, tangible, metaphysical power. The opening of the mouth ceremony is familiar to anyone who has studied Egyptian funerary practices, even casually. It appears in tomb paintings. It is described in numerous papyri. It was one of the central rituals of mummification. The ceremony involved touching specific points on the mummy's face with ritual tools, adzes, and knives made from meteoritic iron, while reciting spells that would restore the deceased's ability to eat, drink, see, hear, and speak in the afterlife. The symbolism was resurrection, reactivation, giving back what death had taken away. But every technology can be reversed. Every spell has a counterspell, and if you can open a mouth, you can also seal it shut. There are references, scattered and fragmentary, to what some researchers call the closing ritual. It does not have an official name, because it was never meant to be written down in the public texts. The descriptions we have come from marginal notes in priestly manuals, from palimpsests where later texts were written over earlier ones, and the original words can still be detected under certain lighting, from ostraca, those broken pieces of pottery and limestone that scribes used for practice or informal notes, the kind of material that was never supposed to survive but sometimes did. One such ostracon, currently in the possession of the Petrie Museum in London, though rarely displayed, contains what appears to be a checklist. It is written in hieratic script from the 19th dynasty, and it outlines a procedure in clinical, almost bureaucratic detail. First item, remove the amulet of the heart scarab. Second, extract the wadjet eye from the wrappings. Third, speak the words of unbinding over the tongue. Fourth, sever the connection between Ka and Ba using the iron blade. Fifth, seal the name within obsidian. Sixth, bury the shadow separately from the body. When this was first translated in the early 1900s, the scholar who worked on it assumed it was some kind of magical curse, perhaps something used against enemies. But look at the context. This was not found in a tomb or a temple. It was found in a refuse heap near Deir el-Medina, the village where the workers who built the royal tombs lived. These were not sorcerers or renegade magicians. These were craftsmen, artisans, the people who actually did the physical work of preparing the dead. And they had instructions, step-by-step guides for procedures that were clearly routine enough to warrant written reminders. Think about what that means. This was not some rare, extreme measure taken only in exceptional circumstances. This was part of the job. Some bodies got the standard treatment, the full preservation and resurrection package. Other bodies got something else, and the workers needed to know which was which and what to do in each case. The tools matter. Archaeology has recovered thousands upon thousands of embalming implements. Knives for the initial incisions, hooks for removing the brain through the nose, spatulas for applying resins, needles for stitching, all standard equipment. But there are other tools, rarer and harder to interpret, that do not fit the conventional understanding of mummification. In 1989, a storage room at the Louvre was being reorganized when curators discovered a box that had been mislabeled and forgotten for nearly a century. Inside were bronze implements from a 20th dynasty tomb, supposedly ritual objects, though no one had studied them carefully. When they were finally examined by a specialist in ancient metallurgy, something peculiar emerged. These were not ceremonial, they were functional, highly functional, precision cutting tools with edges that had been used extensively, sharpened and resharpened over years of service. But they were the wrong shape for normal embalming work. One resembled a modern surgical saw, designed specifically for cutting through bone without damaging surrounding tissue. Another was a curved blade with a hook on the end, perfect for reaching into a body cavity and severing specific structures. A third was essentially a specialized hammer, weighted and balanced for delivering controlled impacts. These were not tools for preserving the dead. These were tools for taking them apart. The box also contained something else, a small papyrus fragment, badly damaged, that had been wrapped around the tools. The surviving text was fragmentary, but certain phrases were legible. For those who must not rise. By authority of the Sem, let no god hear his name. This was not a burial, this was a kit. A professional toolkit for a very specific job. And who performed this job? We keep coming back to the Sem priests. On the surface, their role seems straightforward. They were senior clergy responsible for funerary rites, distinguished by their leopard skin mantles. They appear in tomb art performing the opening of the mouth, making offerings, overseeing the burial process. Respected figures, holy men. But there are hints, if you know where to look, that the Sem priesthood had layers, public functions, and private ones. There is a text from the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, that describes the hierarchy of the priesthood in unusual detail. It mentions the Sem priests, yes, but it also refers to a subset called the Hemkar, which translates roughly as servants of the Ka. And it says their duties were performed in darkness and away from the eyes of men. They were not part of the public ceremonies. They worked in private, in secret, and their training included knowledge that was explicitly restricted, forbidden to be shared with anyone outside their order. What knowledge? The text does not say, but it does mention that the Hemkar were the only priests authorized to handle certain types of magic classified as Heka Shemsu, which means something like following magic or magic of binding. Not creative magic, not protective magic, but magic that constrained, that limited, that prevented. There is a tomb at Saqqara, discovered in 2006, that belonged to a man named Ptahshepses, who lived during the 5th dynasty. His titles are impressive: Chief of Secrets, Overseer of all works of the King, Master of the House of Life. But there is one title that appears only once, in a small inscription above a doorway leading to a side chamber: Hem Ka Shatait, Servant of the Secret Ka. The chamber itself was empty when archaeologists opened it, but the walls were covered in texts, spells, yes, but not the usual protective spells or hymns to the gods. These were instructions, procedures, methods for separating the components of the soul, for binding them individually, for ensuring they could not reunite after death. The chamber had been deliberately defaced at some point in antiquity. Someone had gone through and chiseled out key words, making the spells incomplete and therefore, in theory, powerless. But enough remains to get the general idea, and the idea is terrifying. These were not metaphors or symbolic descriptions. They read like technical manuals. If you want to trap the bar, you do this. If you want to disperse the car, you do that. If you want to ensure the ark never forms, you follow these specific steps in this specific order. One passage describes the preparation of what it calls the vessel of containment. It required a mixture of cedar resin, myrrh, and a substance called jarret, which most scholars think was some kind of mineral salt. The mixture was to be poured into the chest cavity after the heart had been removed, and specific spells recited while it hardened. The text claims this would create a seal that no soul could pass, no god could break, eternal as stone, binding as the word of Thoth. Hyperbole? Religious poetry? Maybe. But remember, we have mummies with their chest cavities filled with hardened resin mixed with mineral compounds. We dismissed it as just sloppy embalming or later restoration work. But what if it was not? What if those preparations were intentional, done according to formulas like the one in Ptahshepses' tomb, meant to create a spiritual barrier? Then there are the execration texts, which are not secret at all. Thousands of them have been found. They are one of the better documented aspects of Egyptian magic. The practice was simple. Write the name of an enemy on a clay figure or pottery shard, recite a curse, then smash the object. Sympathetic magic. The breaking of the figure represented the breaking of the enemy's power. Standard stuff, found in many cultures. But some execration texts are different. A cache discovered at Saqqara in the 1920s contained over 200 pottery bowls, all inscribed with names and all deliberately shattered. Most of the names were foreigners: Nubians, Libyans, Asiatics, enemies of Egypt. But mixed in were Egyptian names, and some of those names had additional notations. Not just may he be destroyed, but may his car be scattered, and may his name be forgotten, and, most disturbing, may he not know rest in death or life, may he be neither living nor dead, but bound between. That last phrase appears on 17 different bowls. 17 individuals who were cursed not just to die, but to exist in some kind of liminal state, trapped between life and death, and several of those names have been identified. They were real people, officials from the Middle Kingdom whose tombs have been found. And when those tombs were excavated, guess what? Mutilated mummies, missing limbs, destroyed skulls, post-mortem violations that match the patterns we have been discussing. The execration texts were not just about cursing enemies. They were part of a larger system, a magical legal framework for dealing with threats to cosmic order. And sometimes those threats came from within, from people who were too powerful, too knowledgeable, too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing even after death. In 2013, a very strange papyrus was acquired by the Egyptian Museum from a private collection. The provenance was questionable, which usually means it was looted at some point, but the document itself was authenticated as genuine, dating to the 21st dynasty. It is now catalogued as Papyrus Cairo JE 99412, and as far as I can tell, it has never been fully published or translated for public consumption. But a preliminary analysis was included in an internal museum report that was leaked online a few years ago. The papyrus is titled, as near as can be translated, The Book of Overthrowing the Rebel Dead, not Apophis, the chaos serpent who appears in the similarly titled Book of Overthrowing Apophis, not a mythological enemy. The rebel dead, actual deceased human beings who were considered threats, and the book describes, in precise ritual language, how to neutralize them. It includes 42 spells, each targeting a different aspect of the afterlife journey. Spell 12 prevents the deceased from speaking the names of power. Spell 18 binds the shadow to the body. Spell 24 scatters the Ka to the four winds. Spell 39, and this is the one that caught everyone's attention, is titled, To Prevent the Transfiguration. The transfiguration, the transformation into an Akh, was the whole point of Egyptian funerary religion. It was the goal. The blessed state where you became an effective spirit, capable of interacting with the gods, dwelling in paradise. This spell was designed to stop that from happening, to lock someone permanently in a lesser state, powerless, confused, suffering. Why would such a spell exist? Under what circumstances would the priests decide that someone needed to be prevented from achieving the afterlife they had spent their entire life preparing for? The papyrus does not explain. It just provides the methodology, as if the when and why were obvious, as if everyone knew there were certain people who could not be allowed to complete the journey. The leaked report notes that several of the spells in the papyrus match, almost word for word, inscriptions found in tombs with mutilated mummies. The connection is direct. This was not theoretical magic. This was applied magic, used on real people, in real situations by priests who believed it worked. There is one more element we need to discuss, and it is the most disturbing. Some of the mutilated mummies show signs that the procedures were performed while the wrappings were still in place. The cuts went through the linen. The blows to the skull crushed both bone and bandages together, which means the priests could not see what they were doing. They were working blind, relying entirely on knowledge of anatomy and years of training to know exactly where to cut, where to strike, how deep to go. That level of skill does not develop casually. It requires practice, lots of practice, which raises an unavoidable question. How many bodies did they practice on? How many mummies were destroyed during training before a Hemkar priest became proficient enough to perform the rituals correctly? And what happened to those practice bodies? Were they just discarded? Or are they still out there, buried in unmarked graves, waiting to be found? There are stories, again unverifiable but persistent, of excavations uncovered mass burials, dozens of bodies, all mummified but badly damaged, buried without markers or grave goods. The official explanation is always the same. Victims of tomb robbery, bodies thrown out by looters searching for valuables. But people who have seen these burials privately describe something else. Consistent damage, ritual patterns, the same types of mutilations we have been discussing, but cruder, rougher, as if done by someone still learning the technique. If those stories are true, then we are looking at something even darker than we thought. Not just a practice performed on specific dangerous individuals, but a tradition, an ongoing operation that spanned centuries and involved training new generations of priests in techniques that were never supposed to be acknowledged publicly. A shadow institution within the Egyptian priesthood, responsible for containing threats that the living could not eliminate and the dead could not escape from, and all of it hidden beneath layers of religious language and ritual symbolism that made it invisible to outsiders. That makes it invisible even now to researchers who are not looking for it, who do not want to see it, who prefer the comfortable narrative of ancient Egypt as a culture obsessed with life after death, rather than a culture that sometimes decided certain people should not have an afterlife at all. The procedures existed, the tools existed, the training existed, the bodies exist. What we are left with is not whether this happened, but how widely, how often, and most importantly, whether anyone is still trying to keep it secret. History is written by those who control the archives. And when it comes to Egyptian archaeology, the archives have been controlled by a very specific group of people for a very long time. European colonial powers in the 19th century, Western academic institutions in the 20th, and throughout it all, a network of museums, universities, and governmental bodies that decide what gets studied, what gets published, and what gets locked away where the public will never see it. Sometimes artifacts disappear for mundane reasons, cataloguing errors, storage mishaps, the general chaos of managing collections that number in the hundreds of thousands. But sometimes things vanish in ways that suggest intention, purpose, a deliberate effort to remove certain objects from circulation and public awareness. Let me tell you about the summer of 1882. Egypt was under British occupation, tensions were high, and Cairo was not a safe place for foreigners. In June of that year, anti-British riots broke out across the city. The Egyptian Museum, then located in Bulaq near the Nile, was caught in the crossfire. Officially, the museum was evacuated and closed temporarily while order was restored. A few artifacts were damaged in the chaos, nothing major, and everything returned to normal within weeks. That is the official story. But there is another version, one that circulated among the museum staff and archaeologists working in Egypt at the time. According to this account, the riots provided cover for something else entirely. A group of artifacts, specifically mummies from the museum's storage vaults, were removed during the evacuation, not by looters, not by rioters, by museum officials themselves, working in coordination with British authorities. The number varies depending on who is telling the story. Some say 37 mummies, others claim it was closer to 50. But the consistent detail is this: these were not ordinary mummies. These were specimens that showed signs of ritual mutilation, damaged in ways that raised uncomfortable questions. And rather than keep them where researchers might examine them, where journalists might photograph them, where the public might start asking what had been done to these people and why, someone decided they needed to go. Where did they go? No one knows for certain. Some supposedly ended up in private collections. Others were allegedly shipped to England, possibly to the British Museum or to university collections, where they were catalogued under vague descriptions that gave no hint of their true condition. A few, according to one particularly dark rumour, were simply destroyed, burned or dumped in the Nile, erased from existence because what they represented was too problematic to preserve. Is there any proof? Not hard evidence? No. But there are gaps in the museum's records from that period. Inventory lists that do not match. Acquisition numbers that skip without explanation. And there are letters, private correspondence between museum directors and British officials that reference problematic specimens and artifacts requiring discretion. The letters do not specify what made these artifacts problematic. They just acknowledge that certain items needed to be handled carefully, kept out of the wrong hands. One letter in particular, written by Gaston Maspero, the French Egyptologist who directed the museum in the 1880s, mentions a conversation with British Consul General Evelyn Baring. Maspero writes, and I am translating loosely from the French, that Baring expressed concern about certain discoveries, giving the wrong impression to the public, and potentially undermining confidence in the scientific integrity of Egyptian studies. Maspero assured him that appropriate measures would be taken. What measures? He does not say. But shortly after that letter, multiple mummies disappeared from the museum records. Fast forward to the early 20th century. Egyptology was professionalizing, becoming more academic, less treasure hunting, and more scientific archaeology. Standards were being established for excavation, documentation, and publication. This was also when certain researchers started noticing patterns in the mummies they were examining, patterns that suggested widespread ritual mutilation. One of those researchers was Margaret Murray. If you know anything about early Egyptology, you probably know her name. She was a pioneering female archaeologist at a time when the field was overwhelmingly male. She worked on major excavations, taught at University College London, and published extensively. She was also, in her later years, known for some controversial theories about European witchcraft that most scholars now consider completely unfounded. But before she went down that particular rabbit hole, she did serious, credible work on Egyptian mummies. In 1924, Murray published a paper in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology titled Evidence for Funerary Mutilation Practices in the Middle Kingdom. It was based on her examination of mummies at the Manchester Museum, where she had access to specimens that had been unwrapped and studied in detail. She documented systematic dismemberment in 6 mummies, all from roughly the same period and region. She proposed that this was not post-mortem damage from tomb robbers, but deliberate ritual practice performed by priests as part of the burial process. The paper created a minor stir. Some colleagues praised her meticulous documentation. Others dismissed it as overinterpretation of natural decay or later damage. But the real pushback came from an unexpected source. The Egypt Exploration Society, the major British organization funding excavations in Egypt, contacted the journal and requested, strongly, that Murray's paper not be cited or referenced in future publications. No explanation was given publicly. But Murray herself later wrote in her memoirs that she had been told her findings were unhelpful to the Society's fundraising efforts, and that donors preferred stories of glorious ancient Egypt rather than accounts of mutilated corpses and dark rituals. Murray never published on this topic again. She shifted her research focus to other areas, and by the 1930s she was deep into her witch cult theories, which effectively discredited her in the eyes of mainstream academia. Whether that shift was coincidental or whether she was encouraged, subtly or not so subtly, to pursue less controversial topics, we will never know. But her career trajectory follows a pattern. Researcher makes uncomfortable discovery. Researcher publishes findings. Researcher faces professional consequences. Researcher either stops publishing on that topic or stops being taken seriously in their field. She was not the only one. In the 1930s, a German Egyptologist named Heinrich Schäfer was working on translating papyri from the Berlin Egyptian Museum. He came across texts describing what he called Vernichtungsrituale, destruction rituals, aimed at preventing the dead from achieving afterlife. He mentioned these in a lecture in 1936, suggesting they represented a heretofore unrecognized aspect of Egyptian mortuary practice. The lecture was not well received. Colleagues accused him of misinterpreting the texts, of reading sinister meanings into what were probably just standard curses against tomb robbers. Schäfer prepared a detailed paper responding to these criticisms, including new translations and comparative analysis with similar texts. The paper was scheduled for publication in 1939. It never appeared. The journal claimed the manuscript was lost. Schäfer's personal papers, which should have contained a copy, were destroyed during World War II when his apartment in Berlin was bombed. Convenient timing. Maybe genuinely tragic luck, or maybe someone took advantage of the chaos of war to make sure certain research disappeared. After the war, no one followed up on Schäfer's work. The topic was simply dropped. And when his name appears in modern Egyptology, it is always in reference to his other contributions, his work on Egyptian art and language. The Vernichtungsrituale are not mentioned. It is as if that part of his research never existed. Now, you might be thinking this is just normal academic disagreement. Controversial theories get challenged all the time. Researchers pursue ideas that do not pan out. Papers get rejected. That is how science works. And you would be absolutely right. Except for one thing. The pattern is too consistent. Too many researchers, across too many decades, running into the same wall, discovering evidence of ritual mutilation, trying to publish about it, and facing either direct suppression or professional marginalization that effectively silences them. In the 1960s, something strange happened at the Vatican. This is where things get genuinely weird, so bear with me. The Vatican has always had an interest in ancient Egypt. They have one of the finest collections of Egyptian artifacts outside of Egypt itself. Obelisks in St. Peter's Square, statues in the Vatican museums, and in the Vatican Library, manuscripts and papyri that most researchers never get to see. In 1963, Pope John XXIII established a special commission to study what were described as pre-Christian religious practices with potential theological implications. The commission was small, maybe 5 or 6 scholars, and they worked in complete secrecy. No public announcements, no published findings. But members of the commission did occasionally correspond with colleagues outside the Vatican, and some of those letters have survived. One letter, written by Father Pierre Benoit, A French biblical scholar who served on the commission mentions that they were examining Egyptian texts concerning the binding and control of souls after death. He writes that the commission was trying to determine whether these practices represented genuine spiritual manipulation or merely superstitious ritual. And he notes, almost as an aside, that some commission members believed the practices described in the Egyptian texts were incompatible with Christian doctrine regarding the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body. The commission dissolved in 1965 without issuing any public report. The materials they studied were returned to the restricted sections of the Vatican Library, and the whole episode was essentially forgotten until researchers going through Benoit's papers after his death in the 1980s found the letters and started asking questions. The Vatican's response was polite but firm. The Commission's work was internal theological consultation and not relevant to public scholarship. The materials they examined remain restricted. Requests for access are routinely denied. Why would the Vatican care about Egyptian soul-binding rituals? What theological implications could possibly concern them enough to form a secret commission? The obvious answer is that if the ancient Egyptians had genuine techniques for manipulating souls, for trapping or destroying them, that would fundamentally contradict Christian teaching about the soul's inviolability and God's sovereignty over life and death, you cannot have both. Either souls are under God's exclusive dominion, or they can be controlled by human ritual. The Church needed to resolve that question, at least internally, to maintain doctrinal consistency. But there might be another reason, a more practical one. If the Catholic Church, which has spent centuries condemning magic and sorcery, officially acknowledged that ancient magical practices might have been effective, that would open a very large can of theological worms. Better to keep it quiet, study it privately, draw whatever conclusions are necessary for internal use, and never, ever, let the public debate begin. Let us jump forward to more recent times. In 2015, Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities announced a major new excavation at Saqqara. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed a massive complex of previously unknown tombs and tunnels beneath the Step Pyramid complex. This was huge news. Saqqara keeps giving up secrets, and every new discovery adds to our understanding of the Old Kingdom. The excavation proceeded through 2016 and 2017. Regular updates were posted on the ministry's website, photographs of newly opened tombs, artifacts being carefully catalogued, the usual stuff. Then, in late 2017, the updates stopped. No explanation, no announcement that the excavation was complete or suspended. Just silence. Archaeologists working on other projects in the area reported seeing the site cordoned off with unusual security. Not the normal guards and fencing you would expect, but actual military personnel. Someone was clearly still working there, but no information was being released. When journalists asked the ministry about it, they got vague responses about ongoing conservation work and preliminary analysis that needed to be completed before publication. It is now 2025. 8 years later, nothing has been published about what was found in that excavation. The ministry's website has removed the original announcements. Requests from foreign institutions for permission to study the materials have been denied or simply ignored, and the site itself is now listed as closed to researchers indefinitely, officially due to structural instability. What did they find? Why the secrecy? I have heard speculation, impossible to confirm, that the excavation uncovered a cache of mummies showing extensive ritual mutilation along with associated papyri, describing the procedures in detail. The kind of evidence that would definitively prove this was widespread practice, not isolated incidents. And the Egyptian government, understandably protective of their national heritage and very sensitive to anything that might portray ancient Egypt in a negative light, decided the find was too controversial to reveal, so they sealed it up, classified it, made it disappear from the public record. Is that what happened? I do not know. No one outside a very small circle knows, but the pattern is familiar. Discovery that challenges the accepted narrative, initial excitement, then sudden silence and restricted access. It is the same playbook that has been used for over a century whenever evidence of Egyptian ritual mutilation surfaces. UNESCO adds another layer to this. Since the 1990s, certain areas of major archaeological sites in Egypt have been designated as restricted zones, not open to tourists, not open to most researchers, officially protected to prevent damage and preserve them for future study with better technology. That all makes perfect sense. You do not want tourists trampling through fragile tombs. You want to preserve sites for future generations when we might have better tools for non-destructive analysis. But some of these restricted zones are peculiar. They are not the most fragile or artistically significant areas. They are not the royal tombs or the best preserved temples. They are seemingly random sections. Small tombs, storage chambers, areas that you would think would be lower priority for preservation, yet access is completely forbidden. Satellite imagery is restricted. Even aerial photography by drones is prohibited in these specific zones, enforced by Egyptian military regulations. Why? What is in those restricted areas that requires such tight control? The official answer is always the same: conservation, future research, national security in terms of protecting cultural heritage, all reasonable, all possibly true, but also, conveniently, impossible to verify because no one except authorized personnel is allowed to look. There are researchers, people with decades of experience working in Egypt, who will tell you privately that the restrictions are not about conservation. They are about control. Control over narrative. Control over what the public learns about Egyptian history. Control over which discoveries get celebrated and which ones get quietly buried, both literally and figuratively. One archaeologist, speaking on condition of anonymity, told me that he was once given access to a restricted tomb at Saqqara. He will not say which one or what he was doing there, but he described finding a burial chamber with 5 mummies, all showing signs of dismemberment and mutilation. He was documenting the site, taking notes and photographs, when officials arrived and told him his access was revoked. He was escorted out immediately. His photographs were confiscated, and he was informed that if he published anything about what he had seen, his permission to work in Egypt would be permanently revoked. That is the power dynamic. Egypt controls access to the sites. If you want to work there, you play by their rules. And their rules include not publishing findings that might embarrass the modern Egyptian government or undermine tourism, which is a crucial part of the economy. Ancient Egypt is a brand, a valuable one, and brands need to be managed carefully. The problem is not unique to Egypt. Every country with significant archaeological resources faces similar tensions between scientific openness and national interests. But in Egypt, where ancient history is so central to national identity, the pressures are particularly intense. And when you combine that with over a century of Western institutions having their own reasons to avoid uncomfortable topics, you get a situation where certain truths might never emerge, where evidence sits in storage, unexamined and unpublished, because no one with the authority to bring it to light has sufficient incentive to do so. So what do we actually know versus what do we suspect? We know that ritual mutilation of mummies occurred. The physical evidence is undeniable. We know that this was not random damage but followed consistent patterns suggesting deliberate procedure. We know that texts exist describing soul binding and soul destruction rituals. We know that multiple researchers across multiple decades have tried to study this topic and faced either professional consequences or had their work suppressed. What we suspect, but cannot prove, is that the full extent of these practices has been deliberately obscured, that there are artifacts in storage, documents in restricted archives, even entire sites that contain evidence which would transform our understanding of Egyptian mortuary religion, and that various institutions, for various reasons ranging from protecting reputations to maintaining tourism revenue to avoiding theological complications, have chosen to keep that evidence hidden. Maybe that makes me sound like a conspiracy theorist. Maybe I am connecting dots that should not be connected. But when the pattern is this consistent, when the silences are this loud, when the restrictions are this comprehensive, it is hard not to conclude that someone, somewhere, knows more than they are telling, and that what they know would change everything we think we understand about how the ancient Egyptians dealt with death, souls, and the terrifying possibility that some people should never be allowed to die. We need to step back and take a breath here, because it is very easy, when you are deep into ancient mysteries and institutional cover-ups, to lose sight of the fundamental question, not whether ritual mutilation happened, we have established that it did, but whether it actually worked, whether the ancient Egyptians were doing something real, something that had genuine metaphysical effects, or whether they were just performing elaborate theatre based on beliefs that, however sincerely held, had no basis in reality. The scientific establishment has an answer to this, and it is straightforward. Ancient Egyptians believed in magic and an afterlife. They developed complex rituals based on those beliefs. They performed those rituals with great care and precision because they genuinely thought they were effective. But belief does not make something true. The rituals did not actually trap souls or destroy consciousness because souls and consciousness, in the way the Egyptians understood them, do not exist as independent entities that can be manipulated by physical procedures. The mutilations, from this perspective, were punishment, social control, a way to dishonor enemies even after death, to send a message to the living about what happens when you cross the pharaoh or violate religious law. The elaborate theology around soul binding was just justification, a way to frame what was essentially political violence in religious terms that made it acceptable to the society. Dr. Robert Rittner at the University of Chicago is one of the foremost experts on Egyptian magic and has written extensively about these practices. His position, which represents the mainstream academic view, is that Egyptian magic was psychological and social, not supernatural. The priests believed they were manipulating spiritual forces, but what they were actually manipulating was human behavior. The threat of having your mummy mutilated, of being denied the afterlife, was a powerful form of social control. It kept people in line. That was the real magic. Fear. And there is a lot of merit to this explanation. Humans across every culture and time period have used religion to justify political power. The Egyptian priesthood was enormously powerful, economically and politically. They had every incentive to develop theological frameworks that reinforced their authority. Soul-binding rituals, the threat of spiritual annihilation, these would have been incredibly effective tools for maintaining order and eliminating rivals. Look at the victims: high-ranking officials, priests who fell out of favor, people who challenged the system. Their mutilation was not random, it was targeted, and the message was clear. No matter how powerful you are in life, we control what happens to you after death. Cross us, and we will destroy not just your body but your eternal soul. That is a level of control that goes beyond simple physical violence. That is existential terror as a political weapon. From a purely rational standpoint, this explanation works. It accounts for all the evidence without requiring us to believe in souls, magic, or the supernatural. It is parsimonious, elegant, and it allows modern researchers to study these practices without having to grapple with uncomfortable metaphysical questions. But here is where it gets tricky, because while the mainstream explanation accounts for why the Egyptians did what they did, it does not fully account for how seriously they took it. The amount of effort involved in these rituals was staggering. The specialized training, the precision tools, the secret texts, the multi-generational transmission of knowledge. This was not theater for public consumption. Much of it was done in private, in sealed tombs, where no one except the priests performing the rituals would ever see it. If this was just about social control and sending messages, why go to such extraordinary lengths when no one was watching? Why develop such sophisticated techniques for procedures that would never be witnessed? Why maintain secret orders of priests whose entire purpose was performing rituals that, if the scientific explanation is correct, accomplished absolutely nothing except satisfying the performer's own superstitions? You could argue that the priests themselves were true believers, that they genuinely thought they were doing something real and necessary. And that is probably true, but it pushes the question back a level. Why did they believe so strongly? Where did these beliefs come from? And why did they persist for over 1,000 years despite requiring enormous resources and effort to maintain? Most religious practices that do not produce tangible results fade away eventually. Societies figure out that rain dances do not actually make it rain, that sacrifices do not actually appease angry gods. Trial and error, over generations, tends to eliminate practices that are purely superstitious. But the Egyptian soul-binding rituals did not fade. They persisted. They became more elaborate, more systematic, as if they were learning and refining techniques based on some kind of feedback. Now, before anyone accuses me of arguing that ancient magic was real, let me be clear. I am not saying that. What I am saying is that the standard scientific explanation, while rational and defensible, leaves some questions unanswered, and maybe we should sit with those questions rather than pretending we have everything figured out. There is a middle ground here that is worth considering. What if the Egyptians were not manipulating souls in some supernatural sense, but they were manipulating something? Human consciousness, even after death, might have properties we do not fully understand. Modern neuroscience has barely scratched the surface of what consciousness is, how it arises from physical brain activity, and whether it might persist in some form after the brain stops functioning. Studies on near-death experiences, for example, have documented cases where people report detailed awareness during periods when their brains showed no measurable activity. Cardiac arrest patients who were clinically dead, no heartbeat, no brainwaves, who were later revived and could describe conversations that happened in the operating room while they were flatlined. Skeptics have various explanations for these accounts, from false memories to brief periods of minimal brain activity that were not detected. But the phenomenon is real enough that it is being studied seriously by researchers at major universities. Quantum theories of consciousness, proposed by physicists like Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, suggest that consciousness might arise from quantum processes in brain microtubules. If that is true, and it is a big if, then consciousness might not be entirely dependent on large-scale brain structure. It might be a quantum phenomenon that could potentially persist in some form even after the physical brain is destroyed. I am not endorsing these theories. The science is far from settled, but the point is that consciousness is weird. We do not really understand it, and in our ignorance, there is space for possibilities that would have seemed absurd a few decades ago. What if the Egyptians, through thousands of years of observing death and experimenting with preservation techniques, stumbled onto something? Not magic in the sense of violating natural laws, but practices that had real effects on consciousness or brain states, or whatever it is that makes us subjectively aware. They would not have had the language to describe it scientifically. They would have understood it through their religious framework, talking about souls and gods and the afterlife. But maybe, underneath the mythology, there was a kernel of genuine insight. Consider mummification itself. From a modern perspective, it is futile. Preserving the body does not preserve consciousness. When the brain dies, you are gone. But maybe the Egyptians observed something we have not. Maybe in their extensive experience with death and corpses, they noticed phenomena that suggested consciousness or awareness persisting in ways that connected to the physical body. And they developed techniques based on those observations. The mutilations could have been, in that framework, not symbolic but functional, destroying specific parts of the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, areas where consciousness might somehow linger or reconnect, not because they understood neuroscience as we do, but because they had empirical knowledge, passed down over centuries, about what procedures seemed to prevent whatever it was they were trying to prevent. This is speculation, obviously, but it is speculation that takes seriously the possibility that the Egyptians were rational actors working from their own observations and experiences, not just superstitious primitives following arbitrary traditions. There is another angle worth considering. Anthropological research on belief in the afterlife across cultures shows some interesting patterns. Nearly every human society has had concepts of souls, spirits, or consciousness persisting after death. The specifics vary wildly, but the basic idea is almost universal. Evolutionary psychologists have proposed that this might be an evolutionary adaptation. Belief in the afterlife makes death less terrifying, which could provide survival advantages by making people more willing to take necessary risks. But there is another interpretation. What if these beliefs are so universal because they are pointing at something real, not necessarily supernatural, but some aspect of consciousness or subjective experience that manifests across cultures and gets interpreted through local religious frameworks? The Egyptians would have been working with the same underlying phenomenon as every other culture, but they took it further. They tried to control it, to manipulate it, to use it for social and political purposes, and maybe, just maybe, they figured out techniques that actually worked on some level, not trapping literal souls in corpses, but affecting consciousness states, memory, identity in ways that we would now describe in neurological or psychological terms, but that they understood as spiritual manipulation, or maybe not. Maybe the scientific consensus is entirely correct, and the Egyptians were just very committed to elaborate superstitions. The problem is, we do not have a way to definitively settle the question. We cannot run controlled experiments on whether soul-binding rituals work. We cannot measure whatever it is the Egyptians thought they were measuring. We are left with interpretation and inference, and different people will draw different conclusions based on their prior beliefs about the nature of consciousness and reality. What we can say with certainty is this: the Egyptians believed they could trap and destroy souls. They developed sophisticated techniques for doing so. They applied those techniques systematically over many centuries, and they went to extraordinary lengths to keep the details secret, both in ancient times and, possibly, in modern times, through institutional control of archaeological evidence. Whether they were actually accomplishing something metaphysical or just engaging in elaborate self-deception is, ultimately, a question we cannot answer with the evidence available. But the fact that we cannot answer it, the fact that there is still mystery here despite all our scientific advancement and archaeological discovery, that tells us something important. It tells us that we do not know everything, that the ancients might have understood things we have forgotten, and that dismissing their practices as pure superstition might be closing our minds to possibilities that make us uncomfortable, but that deserve serious consideration. The universe is stranger than we think, consciousness is stranger than we think, and maybe, just maybe, death is stranger than we think. The Egyptians spent 3,000 years exploring that strangeness. They left us evidence of what they found, carved in stone and wrapped in linen and buried in sand. We owe it to them, and to ourselves, to look at that evidence with genuinely open minds, not predetermined to accept or reject based on what fits comfortably within our current worldview. Because if they were wrong, understanding why they were wrong teaches us about human psychology and the power of belief. But if they were right, even partially right, about anything they discovered, then we have been missing something fundamental about the nature of existence. And that possibility, however unlikely it might seem, is worth taking seriously. Theory and analysis can only take us so far. At some point, you need to look at the actual bodies, the individual human beings who suffered these procedures, because behind every mutilated mummy is a person who lived, who died, and who then had something terrible done to them. These are not abstract concepts or academic curiosities. These are human stories, even if we can only piece together fragments of what those stories were. Some cases stand out, not because they are typical, but because they are so extreme, so disturbing, that they force us to confront what was really happening in those sealed tombs 3,000 years ago. The Screaming Mummy. That is what everyone calls him, though officially he is Unknown Man E. He was discovered in 1886 in the Deir el-Bahari cache, a hidden tomb packed with royal mummies that had been moved there in antiquity, probably to protect them from robbers. Most of the mummies in that cache were pharaohs and their families, carefully wrapped and clearly identified. But Unknown Man E was different from the moment they opened his coffin. His face, that is what people remember. His mouth is open in what looks like a scream, frozen in an expression of absolute terror or agony. His hands are clenched, his body is twisted, and unlike every other mummy in that cache, he was not properly mummified. No brain removal, no organ extraction, just wrapped in sheepskin, which for Egyptians was ritually unclean, something you would never use for a proper burial. He was shoved into an unmarked coffin with no identification, no titles, no prayers for safe passage. Whoever he was, someone wanted to make sure he suffered in the afterlife. For over a century, his identity was a mystery. Theories ranged from a disgraced prince to a foreign prisoner. Then, in 2012, DNA analysis finally gave an answer. He was almost certainly Pentawere, son of Ramesses III, who was executed for his role in the Harem conspiracy, an attempted assassination of his father. The conspiracy failed. Pentawere and his co-conspirators were caught and sentenced to death. But execution alone was not enough. The Judicial Papyrus of Turin, which describes the conspiracy and its aftermath, uses strange language when referring to Pentaware's fate. It says he was allowed to die by his own hand, which historians interpret as forced suicide. But it also says his name should be obliterated and that he should be prevented from appearing in the afterlife. That goes beyond normal execution. That is spiritual assassination. The sheepskin wrapping was not accidental. It was deliberate defilement. The lack of proper mummification was intentional denial of resurrection. And that scream, frozen on his face, some researchers think he might have been buried alive. That the expression is not post-mortem distortion but actual death agony. That as punishment for trying to kill his father, he was wrapped in unclean material and sealed in a coffin while still breathing, left to suffocate in darkness, knowing that he was being erased from history and denied any chance of eternal life. Can we prove that? No. The evidence is consistent with post-mortem changes in the tissues, but it is also consistent with the other interpretation. And given what we know about Egyptian attitudes toward treason and patricide, given the explicit goal stated in the legal documents to make sure he could not reach the afterlife, it is not implausible that they went that far. Pentaware's mummy is on display in the Cairo Museum. Tourists photograph it constantly, but most of them just see an interesting-looking mummy, maybe read the placard about the harem conspiracy. They do not think about what it means, that they are looking at someone who was not just killed but metaphysically destroyed, someone whose own father orchestrated his eternal damnation. That is not ancient history in an abstract sense. That is horror on a human scale. Then there is Tomb KV-55 in the Valley of the Kings. This tomb is chaos incarnate. When it was discovered in 1907, the excavators found a mess. A partially destroyed coffin, a mummy in terrible condition, everything deliberately damaged and defaced. All the inscriptions identifying the occupant had been chiseled out or covered with gold foil that obscured the hieroglyphs underneath. Who was this person? Over a century later, we still do not know for certain. DNA evidence suggests it might be Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who tried to impose monotheism on Egypt, or it might be Smenkhkare, his co-regent and possible son or brother. The physical evidence is contradictory. The age at death does not quite match either candidate. The dental work suggests one identity, the bone structure suggests another. But whoever it was, someone went to enormous trouble to destroy them. The coffin had been broken open. The mummy's face was smashed. The gold foil covering the inscriptions looked like a last-minute addition, as if someone had tried to hide the identity even while they were desecrating the burial. And here is the disturbing part. This happened multiple times. Evidence suggests the tomb was opened and reclosed at least 3 separate occasions in antiquity, with additional damage done each time. Why? If you just wanted to erase someone from history, you do it once. Destroy the mummy, obliterate the name, seal it up, done. But coming back multiple times? That suggests either different groups with different motives, or a single group that kept checking to make sure the person stayed destroyed, making sure they could not somehow reconstitute themselves or escape whatever prison they had been placed in. The inscriptions that were not completely destroyed include phrases about containing the heretic and binding the rebel. This was not just damnatio memoriae. This was active suppression, as if the person buried there was considered so dangerous, even in death, that their tomb needed to be monitored and maintained as a kind of supernatural containment facility. And maybe it worked too well, because now we cannot even figure out who is in there. Their identity has been so thoroughly destroyed that even modern science cannot definitively recover it. If the goal was to erase someone from existence, to make them unknowable and unmournable, then whoever did this succeeded completely. But the case that haunts me most is not from a royal tomb or a famous pharaoh. It is from a working-class cemetery at Deir el-Medina, the village where the tomb workers lived. In 1934, French archaeologists excavating there found a burial that did not fit any normal pattern. It was a woman, age estimated at 30 to 40 based on skeletal analysis. She was buried in a small tomb, nothing elaborate, with minimal grave goods, but her burial position was wrong. Instead of lying flat on her back or side, standard Egyptian practice, she was curled in a tight fetal position. Her hands were bound behind her back with copper wire, and her body was surrounded, completely encircled, by a ring of limestone fragments carved with protective symbols. Except they were not protective in the usual sense. Standard Egyptian amulets protected the deceased, helped them on their journey. These symbols were different. They were barriers, wards, and they all faced inward, toward the body, not outward to repel external threats. Whoever placed them there was trying to keep something in, not keep something out. The excavators found ostraka nearby, broken pottery with hieratic writing. Most were mundane, household accounts and work rosters, but one was different. It was a complaint, written by one of the villagers, about the woman who walks. It described disturbances, strange noises at night, items going missing, people falling ill, and it demanded that the authorities deal with her properly so she cannot rise. The ostrakon was dated to within a few years of the woman's burial, which means she was blamed for supernatural disturbances while she was alive, and those fears were strong enough that when she died, they took extreme measures to make sure she stayed in the ground. This was not a criminal or a political enemy. This was someone the community feared, someone they thought had power, dangerous power, that would not end with death. Her name, if she ever had one recorded, is lost, but in the excavation reports, she is referred to as Subject 42, and when anthropologists examined her remains, they found something that makes the whole story even more disturbing. Evidence of trepanation. Someone had drilled a hole in her skull while she was alive. The bone had partially healed, so she survived the procedure, at least for a while. But the hole was in an unusual location, at the back of the skull. in an area that modern neuroscience associates with visual processing and, interestingly, with certain types of hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. Was this medical treatment? An attempt to cure epilepsy or migraines? Or was it something else? An attempt to give her visions, to open her perception to realms beyond normal sight? We will never know. But the combination of the trepanation, the community's fear of her, and the extraordinary measures taken to bind her after death paints a picture of someone who was different, who had abilities or experiences that terrified her neighbors, who was seen as a genuine threat even when dead. Her mummy is not in any museum. It was reburied after examination, somewhere in the Deir el Medina necropolis. The French authorities at the time decided it was too fragmentary and unimportant to justify transport and storage, but I wonder sometimes if that was the real reason, or whether someone looked at that burial, at those inward-facing wards, and the copper wire binding, and the fearful ostraca, and decided that maybe, just maybe, it was better to leave her where the ancient Egyptians had put her, to not disturb whatever they had been trying to contain. These three cases, Pentaware, Unknown from KV55, and Subject 42, represent different aspects of Egyptian soul-binding practices: political punishment, religious suppression, community defense against perceived supernatural threats. But they all share the same underlying logic. Some people cannot be allowed to rest peacefully. Some people are too dangerous, too powerful, too wrong in some fundamental way to be permitted the normal journey through the afterlife. And the lengths to which the Egyptians went, the precision of their procedures, the consistency of their methods, suggest they had reasons for believing this. Whether those reasons were based in reality or in superstition, we can debate, but the fear was real. The effort was real. And the human cost, the individual lives destroyed not just in death but in whatever comes after, that was undeniably, horrifyingly real. Egypt was not unique. That realization hit me when I started looking beyond the Nile Valley, beyond the pyramids and papyri, at what other cultures were doing with their dead. Because once you start seeing the pattern, once you know what to look for, you find it everywhere. Different methods, different theologies, different cultural contexts, but the same fundamental fear, the fear that some dead people do not stay dead, that they can come back, that they have power, and that sometimes you need to take extreme measures to make sure they stay in the ground. Start with Europe, medieval and early modern Europe. Specifically, we tend to think of vampire legends as fiction, as gothic horror stories invented by writers like Bram Stoker, but the folklore goes back much further, and it was not considered fiction by the people who practiced it. Vampire prevention was deadly serious business across Eastern Europe, from roughly the 14th through the 18th centuries. Archaeological evidence for this started turning up in the 1990s, and has accelerated in recent years as development projects disturb old cemeteries. What researchers found were burials that had been deliberately modified to prevent the deceased from rising, bodies buried face down, so if they tried to dig out, they would go deeper instead of up, heavy stones placed on top of corpses, iron stakes or wooden stakes driven through the chest, pelvis, or limbs, sickles placed across the neck so any movement would result in decapitation, bricks or stones jammed into the mouth. A cemetery in Poland, excavated in 2014, contained over 300 burials from the 16th and 17th centuries. Roughly 10% of them showed anti-vampire modifications. These were not criminals or outsiders. Based on the burial locations and associated grave goods, these were ordinary members of the community, people who died of illness or old age, and were then subjected to procedures meant to keep them from returning as undead. Why these specific individuals? In some cases, there are clues, bodies that showed signs of infectious diseases, like cholera or plague. In pre-germ theory society, if you died of a mysterious wasting illness, and then your family members started dying too, people might conclude you were feeding on them from beyond the grave. The vampire explanation made sense within their worldview, and staking the body was a rational preventive measure. But other cases do not fit that pattern. Healthy individuals with no signs of disease, people who died violently, yes, but also people who died peacefully in old age. The selection criteria are not always obvious, which suggests local knowledge, community decisions about who was safe to bury normally and who needed extra precautions. Just like in Egypt, where the priests decided who needed soul binding and who did not. The procedures themselves varied by region but shared common logic. Immobilize the body, prevent speech or biting, create physical barriers. These are not symbolic gestures, These are practical measures based on beliefs about what animated corpses could do and how to stop them. And critically, many of these procedures were performed after initial burial. People would dig up a body weeks or months later if problems arose, if the wrong person died at the wrong time, and take additional measures. The parallel to Egyptian practice is striking. Different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, independently developing similar techniques for dealing with the dangerous dead. That suggests something fundamental about human psychology and our relationship with death. We have always understood, on some level, that death does not end everything. That consciousness, identity, power, something persists, and sometimes that something needs to be controlled. Move east to China, and you find a completely different cultural context, but remarkably similar practices. Chinese folklore includes jiangshi, often translated as hopping vampires or hopping corpses. According to traditional beliefs, a person who died violently or improperly could rise as a jiangshi, a reanimated corpse that drained life energy from the living. Prevention methods included binding the body, especially the legs and arms. The idea was that a jiangshi moves by hopping because rigor mortis has set in, so if you restrain the limbs, you prevent movement. Talismans with sacred texts were placed on the forehead to suppress reanimation, and in extreme cases, the body's tendons were cut, literally severing the Achilles tendons and other major connective tissues, so the corpse would be physically incapable of rising, even if animated by supernatural forces. Archaeological evidence for this is harder to document than European vampire burials, because traditional Chinese burial practices were highly variable and regional. But historical texts, particularly from the Qing dynasty, describe these procedures in detail. Manuals for dealing with dangerous corpses, guidelines for which bodies required extra precautions, descriptions of what happens when those precautions are not taken. And here is what is interesting. The Chinese tradition explicitly connected this to qi, the life energy that flows through all living things. A jiangshi was a body that retained qi after death, but lost hun and po, the spiritual and physical souls. Without those regulating forces, the qi became chaotic and dangerous. The prevention techniques were meant to either disperse the qi or prevent it from being used for movement and action. That is sophisticated theoretical framework. Not just the dead can rise, but a specific understanding of what components of being persist after death, which ones are dangerous, and how to neutralize them. It is different from Egyptian theology in the details, but similar in structure. Multiple soul components, some that need to be separated or dispersed. Procedures for accomplishing that separation. South America provides another data point. The Aztecs and other Mesoamerican cultures practiced human sacrifice on a scale that horrified Spanish conquistadors. But what is less well known is what happened to the bodies after sacrifice. In many cases, they were not simply disposed of, they were ritually processed. Hearts were removed, obviously, that was central to the sacrifice itself. But recent archaeological work at sites like Templo Maya in Mexico City has revealed that some sacrificial victims underwent additional post-mortem procedures. Dismemberment, yes, but systematic dismemberment following specific patterns. Removal of hands at the wrists, feet at the ankles, skulls separated and displayed on racks. But some skulls show additional modifications, holes drilled in specific locations, jaws removed and buried separately. The traditional interpretation was that this was part of the sacrificial ritual itself, meant to honor the gods or extract maximum spiritual benefit from the victims. But some researchers now think there was another purpose, that certain sacrificial victims, particularly those who were nobles or warriors captured from enemy cities, people with power and status and strong spiritual essence, were seen as potentially dangerous even after death. The dismemberment was not just ritual theater, it was containment protocol. Aztec theology included concepts of tonali, a life force associated with heat and vigor, and teolia, a divine soul located in the heart. When you sacrificed someone, you offered their teolia to the gods, but their tonali could linger, attached to the body. For ordinary people, that was not a problem. But for powerful individuals, for people who had strong tonali in life, their residual energy could be dangerous, could animate the corpse, could seek revenge. So, you took precautions. You dismembered the body to prevent movement. You separated the skull, the seat of consciousness, from the body. You buried the parts in different locations so they could not reconstitute themselves. Different theology, different rituals, but the same underlying logic as Egyptian soul binding or European vampire prevention. What are we supposed to make of this? The rational explanation is convergent evolution of superstition. Humans fear death. Humans fear the dead. Across different cultures, we independently developed elaborate beliefs about what happens after death and rituals to manage those beliefs. The specific forms vary based on local culture and theology, but the psychological roots are universal. Fear of death leads to belief in afterlife, leads to belief that the afterlife can be dangerous, leads to procedures for managing that danger. That explanation is probably correct, probably, but it does not quite account for the specificity of the parallels. Why do so many cultures settle on dismemberment as the solution? Why the focus on specific body parts, hands, feet, jaws, hearts? Why the consistent idea that powerful individuals require more extreme measures than ordinary people? You could argue that these are simply practical observations of how bodies work. Cutting tendons prevents movement. Removing the jaw prevents biting. These are obvious connections that any culture would make. But that argument assumes the cultures genuinely believed the bodies could move, could act, could pose physical threats. And if they believed that strongly enough to develop systematic procedures for preventing it, maybe they had reasons. Maybe they observed phenomena that we would now explain differently, but that they interpreted as reanimation or spiritual activity. Or maybe not. Maybe this is all just the universal human tendency to project consciousness and agency onto things, to see purpose and intention where there is only mechanism and accident. The dead do not rise. Souls do not linger. Consciousness ends at brain death. Everything these cultures believed was wrong, and all the rituals and procedures and carefully maintained traditions were elaborate responses to imaginary threats. But here is what keeps me up at night. Every single one of these cultures, operating independently, came to the same conclusion. Some dead people are dangerous. Some dead people need to be contained, and they developed remarkably similar techniques for doing so despite having no contact with each other, despite developing these practices in complete isolation, separated by oceans and millennia. That is either an extraordinary coincidence, the same superstition arising independently over and over across human history, or it is evidence that our ancestors, all of them, everywhere, were responding to something real, something about death and consciousness that they experienced directly, and that we, in our modern scientific certainty, have simply stopped paying attention to. I am not saying I know which explanation is correct. I am saying that the global consistency of these practices should make us at least pause before dismissing them entirely as primitive superstition. Because when the same solution appears independently in Egypt, in Europe, in China, in Mesoamerica, maybe, just maybe, there was a real problem they were all trying to solve. The story does not end in ancient tombs. Research is ongoing. New technologies are revealing details that early archaeologists never could have detected. And every few years, another discovery surfaces that forces us to reconsider what we thought we knew about Egyptian burial practices. Ground-penetrating radar has revolutionized archaeology in the past 2 decades. Instead of digging blindly and hoping to find something, researchers can now map entire underground complexes without moving a single shovelful of dirt. The technology uses radar pulses to detect variations in soil density, revealing chambers, tunnels, artifacts, anything that creates a contrast with the surrounding earth. At Saqqara, GPR surveys conducted between 2021 and 2023 have identified over 400 previously unknown structures beneath the sand. That is not 400 tombs total. That is 400 new discoveries in an area that archaeologists thought had been thoroughly explored. Each one represents a potential window into practices and beliefs we have never seen before. Some of these structures are unusual. Standard tombs show up on GPR as rectangular chambers with relatively uniform density, but several of the newly detected structures have irregular shapes, multiple small chambers connected by narrow passages, circular layouts instead of the typical linear design, and in a few cases, density patterns that suggest the chambers were deliberately filled with something heavy after construction. Not the gradual accumulation of sand and debris over centuries, but intentional filling, as if whoever built them wanted to seal them permanently. What is in those sealed chambers? No one knows yet. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities has been slow to authorize excavations, partly because they are still processing finds from previous digs, partly because of legitimate concerns about damaging fragile structures, but also, according to researchers who have submitted excavation proposals, because the ministry is being extremely selective about which sites get opened and who gets access. One team from a European university, I am not naming them because they asked me not to, applied for permission to excavate what GPR suggested was a cluster of interconnected chambers. The density readings indicated multiple bodies, far more than you would expect in a private tomb, a mass burial of some kind. Their application was denied without explanation. When they asked for clarification, they were told the site was not a priority and that resources needed to be directed toward more significant discoveries. But here is the thing. The same week their application was denied, the ministry approved excavation of a nearby site that GPR showed to be a much smaller, less complex structure. The difference? The approved site showed normal density patterns, standard tomb layout, no anomalies. The denied site had all the markers of something unusual, something that might raise uncomfortable questions. Maybe that is just bureaucratic randomness. Maybe the ministry has perfectly good reasons for their decisions that have nothing to do with controlling narratives. Or maybe someone looked at those GPR scans and decided that whatever is in those sealed chambers should stay there a little longer. Meanwhile, advances in DNA and isotope analysis are revealing details about the mutilated mummies that change our understanding of who they were. Traditional archaeology relied on burial location and grave goods to determine social status and identity. But now we can extract DNA from bones and teeth, analyze isotope ratios in tooth enamel to determine where someone grew up, even identify family relationships between individuals buried miles apart. A 2022 study published in Nature examined DNA from 40 mummies showing signs of ritual mutilation. The researchers were trying to determine if there were genetic patterns, if certain families or bloodlines were more likely to be targeted. What they found was unexpected. The mutilated individuals came from extremely diverse backgrounds, different regions of Egypt, different genetic lineages. No single family or ethnic group was overrepresented. But here is the interesting part. Isotope analysis showed that several of them were not native Egyptians at all. They grew up in regions corresponding to modern-day Syria, Lebanon, even possibly as far as Anatolia. Foreign-born individuals who at some point migrated to or were brought to Egypt. And then, after they died, they were subjected to the same soul-binding rituals as native Egyptians. Why would Egyptians go to the trouble of performing these complex, expensive rituals on foreigners? If this was about political control or religious orthodoxy, you would expect it to target Egyptians who posed threats to the established order. Foreigners would just be buried or, if they were important enough to mummify at all, given standard treatment. But no, some foreigners received the full containment protocol, which suggests the Egyptians were not just worried about political or religious deviance, they were worried about something else, some quality that transcended nationality or ethnicity, some power or knowledge that certain individuals possessed regardless of where they came from. Digital reconstruction is another frontier. Ancient texts are often damaged, with words or entire passages missing. For decades, scholars could only make educated guesses about what those missing sections originally said. But now, artificial intelligence trained on thousands of intact Egyptian texts can analyze the context, grammar, and common phrasing patterns to predict missing content with surprising accuracy. A project at Oxford University has been using AI to reconstruct damaged sections of funerary papyri. In 2023, they published preliminary results on a 19th dynasty papyrus that was roughly 40% intact. The AI reconstructed the missing sections based on linguistic patterns and comparison with similar texts. When they compared the reconstruction to human expert translations of the intact portions, the AI was accurate about 75% of the time. So they applied the algorithm to papyri that are more fragmentary, where we have no way to verify accuracy, but where the AI can at least give us a plausible version of what might have been there. One of those papyri, from a private collection, was heavily damaged, but contained references to binding the rebellious and sealing the defiant dead. The AI reconstruction filled in surrounding text that described specific procedures, including the phrase, "remove the organ of speech that no spell may be uttered," and "scatter the name to the 4 directions that it may not be reconstituted." Is the reconstruction accurate? Impossible to know for certain. But if the AI is performing at its measured 75% accuracy rate, then most of what it is generating probably reflects what was actually written. And what it is generating describes, in clear procedural language, exactly the practices we have been discussing: soul binding, name destruction, physical mutilation to prevent spiritual function. The researchers submitted their findings for publication in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology. The submission was rejected, not because of methodological concerns with the AI reconstruction, which the reviewers acknowledged was state-of-the-art, but because, and I am quoting from the rejection letter that was leaked online, the conclusions drawn from reconstructed texts are inherently speculative and risk sensationalizing an aspect of Egyptian religion that requires more careful contextualization. Translation: even if you are probably right, we do not want to publish this because it makes ancient Egypt look bad and will generate attention we would rather avoid. That is the state of research in 2025. We have better tools than ever before, technology that can reveal secrets that have been hidden for millennia, but we also have institutions that control access to sites and artifacts, that decide what gets published and what gets shelved, that shape the narrative we are allowed to hear about the past. Some researchers are pushing back. Independent scholars, academics at smaller institutions who have less to lose, even a few senior figures who are approaching retirement and feel free to speak more openly. They are publishing in open access journals, sharing findings on social media, refusing to play along with the polite fiction that everything about ancient Egypt was beautiful and noble and inspiring. But they are swimming against a strong current. The Egyptology establishment has invested over 2 centuries in a particular story about ancient Egypt. That story is embedded in museum displays, in textbooks, in documentaries that get shown to millions of schoolchildren. Changing that story, admitting that we got major aspects of it wrong or incomplete, that would be professionally and institutionally difficult in ways that most researchers are not willing to deal with. So progress happens slowly, incrementally, one paper at a time, each one chipping away at the edges of the accepted narrative. And someday, maybe, enough chips will accumulate that the whole structure shifts, and we can have an honest conversation about what the ancient Egyptians were really doing in those tombs, and why. But until then, most of the public will never hear about the mutilated mummies, the soul-binding rituals, the systematic procedures for trapping and destroying the consciousness of the dead. They will visit museums, see beautifully preserved mummies in gilded cases, and think of ancient Egypt as a civilization that conquered death through preservation and faith. And maybe that is fine. Maybe most people do not need to know the darker aspects. But for those who are curious, for those who want to understand the full reality of what ancient peoples believed and practiced, the information is out there. You just have to be willing to look past the official story and ask the uncomfortable questions. We need to talk about what we are doing with these bodies right now. Because whatever happened 3,000 years ago in Egypt, whatever rituals were performed and why, those mummies are not in tombs anymore. They are in museums. They are being studied, displayed, photographed by tourists, subjected to CT scans and DNA analysis. And that raises questions that the archaeological community has been dancing around for decades. Start with the most basic issue. Should we be displaying mutilated mummies at all? Standard mummies are controversial enough. There is an ongoing debate about whether exhibiting human remains is respectful or exploitative, whether it serves educational purposes or just satisfies morbid curiosity. But mutilated mummies add another layer. These were people who were deliberately violated after death. Someone, for whatever reason, decided they needed to be contained, destroyed, prevented from reaching the afterlife they had prepared for their entire lives. By putting them on display, are we compounding that violation? Are we turning their eternal punishment into entertainment? Or are we fulfilling their worst fear? That they would be exposed to the world, their names and identities obliterated, their bodies turned into objects of curiosity rather than recipients of proper burial rites? Some museums have started removing mummies from display entirely, not just the mutilated ones, but all of them. The Manchester Museum in England made headlines a few years ago by covering several mummy cases with cloths, allowing visitors to choose whether to view the remains. The decision was framed as respecting the dignity of the dead and acknowledging that these were people, not artifacts. Critics called it performative wokeness, accused the museum of caving to political correctness. But what if the issue is not about modern sensibilities at all? What if the ancient Egyptians were right to fear exposure, not in a supernatural sense necessarily, but in a psychological one? These individuals were subjected to procedures meant to destroy their eternal identity. By studying them, naming them, making them famous in a way, are we actually undoing what the ancient priests tried to accomplish? Are we giving them back their names and stories, rescuing them from oblivion? Or are we just violating them again in a different way, extracting data without consent, using their bodies for purposes they could never have imagined or agreed to? The repatriation debate intersects with this in complicated ways. Egypt has been demanding for years that Western museums return artifacts that were removed during the colonial era. The arguments are primarily about cultural heritage and national ownership, but there is a subtext that rarely gets discussed openly. Some of the artifacts Egypt is most insistent about recovering are the problematic ones: the mutilated mummies, the texts describing forbidden rituals, the objects that tell a story about ancient Egypt that the modern Egyptian government would prefer to control. If those artifacts return to Egypt, what happens to them? Are they studied and displayed in Egyptian museums, allowing Egyptian scholars to shape the narrative? Or are they placed in storage, kept away from researchers who might ask the wrong questions? There is no way to know. Egypt's antiquities policy is opaque, and access to sensitive materials is tightly controlled. Western museums resist repatriation partly out of legitimate concerns about preservation and access, but also, let us be honest, because they do not want to give up their Egyptian collections. Those collections drive attendance, generate revenue, form the core of their identity as institutions. Losing them would be financially and culturally devastating. So they fight to keep the artifacts, wrapping their arguments in language about universal heritage and scholarly access, while Egypt fights to get them back, wrapping its arguments in language about colonial injustice and national sovereignty. Lost in this political battle are the individuals whose bodies are being fought over. People who died 3,000 years ago, who had no say in being dug up, no say in being shipped halfway around the world, no say in being studied and displayed and argued over by governments and academics. What would they want? We have no idea. We cannot ask them. And both sides in the repatriation debate claim to be honoring their wishes while pursuing their own institutional interests. There is another ethical dimension that almost no one talks about. If the ancient Egyptians were trying to contain something, if they built these elaborate rituals and procedures because they genuinely believed certain souls were dangerous, what are we doing by disturbing those containment measures, by unwrapping the mummies, by removing them from their tombs, by disrupting the very systems that were meant to hold them in place? From a rational, materialist perspective, this is absurd. There is nothing to contain. The rituals did not work because souls do not exist in the way the Egyptians imagined. We are just dealing with preserved organic matter. No more ethically complicated than studying any other historical artifact. But what if we are wrong? Not necessarily in a supernatural sense, but in our assumption that we fully understand consciousness and death and what persists afterward. The Egyptians spent 3,000 years studying these questions. They developed sophisticated techniques based on observations we can barely reconstruct. Is it really impossible that they knew something we do not? That by dismantling their containment systems, we are releasing something, even if we do not understand what that something is or how to recognize its effects? I am not arguing for leaving everything buried. Knowledge matters. Understanding the past matters. But maybe, just maybe, we should approach these particular artifacts with more caution than we have been. Not out of superstition, but out of epistemic humility, the acknowledgement that we do not know everything, that the ancients might have been responding to real phenomena that we have simply stopped perceiving or paying attention to. At minimum, we should be having these conversations openly, not hiding behind academic jargon or institutional protocols, but actually grappling with the ethical implications of what we are doing with these bodies. They were people. They suffered. They were subjected to procedures meant to destroy their very selves. And now they are in our museums, in our laboratories, part of our research and our entertainment. What do we owe them? What would respect actually look like in this context? I do not have answers, but I think the questions matter, and I think pretending the questions do not exist, that this is just normal archaeology with no special ethical complications, that is a failure of imagination, and a failure of basic human decency toward people who cannot speak for themselves, but whose bodies still carry the evidence of what was done to them. We have covered a lot of ground: mutilated bodies in sealed tombs, secret rituals passed down through generations of priests, institutional cover-ups spanning more than a century, global patterns suggesting something universal about human fear of the powerful dead, modern research revealing details that make the whole picture stranger and more disturbing. But for every question we have explored, a dozen more remain unanswered, and some of those unanswered questions might be the most important ones of all. Why did the practice stop? Egyptian civilization lasted 3,000 years, but the evidence for systematic soul-binding rituals clusters in specific periods. Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, some late-period examples, then it fades. By the time the Greeks and Romans controlled Egypt, by the time Christianity began spreading through the region, these practices seemed to have ended, not because the Romans banned them, not because Christianity condemned them, at least not initially. They just stopped. Did the Egyptians conclude the rituals were not working? Did they develop better methods that left no archaeological trace? Or did whatever threat they were responding to simply go away, making the containment procedures unnecessary? We have no idea. The historical record goes silent on this, and modern researchers have not even really asked the question, because acknowledging the practice requires acknowledging it ended, and explaining why it ended requires taking seriously that it had a purpose beyond mere superstition. How many cases are still undiscovered? We have found hundreds of mutilated mummies, but Egypt is vast. Most of the country has never been systematically surveyed with modern equipment. How many tombs are still buried beneath the sand? How many contain evidence that would transform our understanding of these practices? Thousands? Tens of thousands? And of those, how many will ever be excavated? How many will remain hidden either by chance or by deliberate decision to leave certain sites undisturbed? Is evidence being actively suppressed? This is the conspiracy question, the one that gets you labeled a crank if you push it too hard. But the patterns are there, artifacts that disappear from museum records. Research that gets rejected for reasons that have nothing to do with methodology. Excavation sites that get declared off limits without explanation. Maybe it is all innocent, just the normal chaos of managing massive collections and competing research priorities. Or maybe someone, somewhere, has decided that certain truths about ancient Egypt should not become public knowledge. And here is the biggest question, the one that might seem absurd but that I cannot shake. Were the Egyptians right? Not right in every detail of their theology. Not right that Osiris sits in judgment or that the heart is weighed against a feather. But right about the fundamental insight that consciousness does not simply end at death, that some aspect of identity, awareness, intention persists, that souls, whatever we want to call them, are real, and that in rare cases, for certain individuals, those souls can be dangerous enough to require containment. I am not saying I believe this. I am saying I do not know. None of us know. We have scientific models of consciousness that are incomplete at best. We have philosophical frameworks that cannot agree on basic questions about the nature of mind and self. And we have the testimony of every human culture that has ever existed saying that death is not the end, that something continues, that the boundary between life and death is more permeable than we like to think. The ancient Egyptians took that testimony seriously. They spent millennia developing practices based on it. They created systems for managing the dead that were sophisticated, systematic, and apparently important enough to maintain across dynasties and political upheavals. Maybe they were wrong about everything. Maybe it was all elaborate theatre performed by true believers for an audience of no one. Or maybe, just maybe, they understood something about reality that we have lost. The mutilated mummies are still with us. In museums, in storage facilities, in tombs that have been opened and tombs that remain sealed. They are evidence of something, whether that something is human cruelty, religious fervor, institutional control, or genuine metaphysical insight. What we do with that evidence, how we interpret it, what questions we allow ourselves to ask about it, that will determine whether we learn anything from these ancient practices, or whether we just catalogue them and move on, comfortable in our certainty that we know better than our ancestors. But certainty might be the most dangerous position of all, because the Egyptians were not stupid, they were not primitive, they were sophisticated observers of the natural world, who developed technologies and knowledge systems that we still struggle to fully understand. And if they believed strongly enough in the danger of powerful souls to develop elaborate procedures for containing them, maybe we should at least entertain the possibility that their fear was not entirely unfounded. The questions remain unanswered, the mysteries remain unsolved, and somewhere in Egypt, beneath the sand, there are tombs we have not yet opened, containing bodies we have not yet examined, with secrets we have not yet learned. What we will find when we finally look, and whether we will be ready for what those discoveries might mean, only time will tell.